Hi students, welcome to lesson on emergence of Buddhism and its impact on Indian society. Buddhism is one of the oldest and the world's fourth largest religion with over 520 million followers. About 7% of the global population are known as Buddhists. It originated in ancient India as a Sramana tradition sometime between the 6th and 4th century BC, spreading through much of Asia. The conditions underlying the emergence of Buddhism in ancient India were those generally characteristics of a wider process of socio-cultural transition which took place in the first millennium BC across the face of the civilized world, from Greece to China. In the principal centers of the high cultures, archaic social and religious institutions were breaking down under the pressure from more complex forms of economic and political activity associated with urban revolution and the territorial expansion of new imperial states. In all cases, apparent economic and political advances were mixed with serious social disorders, hardship, and loss of traditional religious moorings. In this process of transformation, new philosophical and religious solutions were sought and attained by the formative thinkers whose teachings still lie behind the institutions and way of life of the world today. The 6th century BC was a period of religious turmoil in India. Simple religious life of ancient India had become complex, elaborate, and expensive in due course of time. The prevalence of the Brahmanical system based on the complicated sacrifice, elaborate ceremonies created unrest among the common people. Further, caste system became rigid, creating inequalities in the society. The Brahmins, who now adorn the status of being the highest in the society, provoked religious propagators to preach a new philosophy of life and death. Many sects arose which were advocating diverse opinions about God and ways of attaining moksha. It was also a reaction to the gross neglect of the social problems of the time, as well as a revolt against the hegemony of the Brahmins in the society. Prominent among them were Buddhism, which emerged in India around 800 to 600 BC. They denied the ultimacy of the Vedas and the ritual significance of caste and gave messages of salvation based on personal conversion, usually without ascriptive limitations of caste, class, sex. After studying this lesson, you should be able to know about the emergence and growth of Buddhism, the main tenets of these religions, and the influence these religions come to the wield on contemporary society. Now we will know about Buddhism. Buddhism became the most popular religion not only in India but in entire Asia. It has been upheld by many scholars that Buddha was not an originator of a new religion but a reformer of the Hindu religion. They contend, as all scholars now admit, that the basic doctrine of Buddhism sprang from the pre-existing Hindu philosophy of the Sankhya system and the later Upanishads. Thus, so far as the original philosophy of Buddhism is concerned, there is hardly any break of continuity between Buddha and the Hindu sages who had preceded him. Nor did Buddha lay down a special ritual for his followers. Even the rules of monastic discipline left by him are but a few, simple and undefined. The rules of morality preached by Buddha were also not new. He simply emphasized a few of them which were already existing. On the contrary, as Kern puts it, the master, the Buddha himself, repeatedly extols the morals and virtues of ancient rishis. Buddhism has wisely adopted many articles of morality and pious customs flowing from the sources of Brahmanistic code. However, the above view is not accepted by the majority of scholars who contend that Buddha was certainly not a reformist of the Hindu religion but the originator of a new one, though he drew heavily from the existing Hindu philosophy and morality. The concept of Buddhism regarding principles of transmigration of soul, fate, and God differ from those of Hinduism. While Hinduism places its gods above the cycle of transmigration of soul, Buddhism regards godhood as a result of good deeds, perishable, and thereby subject to the cycle of birth and rebirth. Again, Buddhism does not believe in God or providence or creator of the universe who participates in determination of fates of individual as Hinduism believes. According to Buddhism, fate is only the former action of everyone. Thus, there are certain differences in the basic philosophy of Hinduism and Buddhism. Besides, whatever might have been the motive of Buddha during his lifetime, Buddhism ultimately grew up as a distinct and different religion. A.L. Basham rightly concludes, whatever be his position in the Buddha's lifetime, 200 years later, Buddhism was a distinct religion. Now, we will talk about the Buddhism as a main tradition. We now turn to the main traditions of Buddhism. Buddhism focuses on the teachings of Gautam Buddha, who was born in Kapilavastu, now Nepal, with the name Siddhartha. Gautam, around the 5th century BC, Buddhism spread throughout the Indian subcontinent in the 5 centuries, following the Buddha's passing, and propagated into Central South Asia and East Asia over the next 2 millennia. It underwent a massive process of missionary diffusion throughout the Asian world, assimilating new values and undergoing major changes in doctrinal and institutional principles. The traditional distinction between the major historical forms of Buddhism is centered on a threefold typology. It is based on doctrinal and institutional differences which seem to fall within relatively homogeneous geographical areas. They are the Theravada, teaching of the elders, located in Southeast Asia, especially in Ceylon, Burma, Thailand, Laos, Vietnam and Cambodia. Next is Mahayana, great vehicle, which is in Nepal, Sikkim, China, Korea and Japan. Next, it is Tantrayana, esoteric vehicle, formerly prevalent in Tibet, Mongolia and parts of Siberia. Today, Theravada represents the sole survivor of the numerous ancient Indian schools. It has a fixed body of fixed literature, a relatively unified orthodox teaching and a clearly structured institutional distinction between the monastic order and laity. On the other hand, the Mahayana is a diffuse and a vastly complex combination of several schools and sects based on a heterogeneous literature of massive proportion. Certain key scriptures exist which are regarded as typifying the more universal thrust of Mahayana principles over the Theravada teachings. The Theravada teachings has traditionally been stigmatized as Hinayana or the small vehicle by the Mahayanist. Now we will understand the doctrine of Buddhism. The term Buddha, meaning enlightened one, refers to the spiritual awakening of an Indian prince named Siddhartha Gautama, who lived in the 6th century BC. Renouncing the privileges of his royal life, he sought to investigate spiritual truth. On so doing, he passed on to the state of enlightenment known as nirvana, which literally means without desire. Soon, he inspired many disciples and came to be known as the sage of the Sakya tribe or as a Sakya Muni, and evolved his own teaching, Dharma. He then embarked on a missionary career, preaching his message of salvation openly to all. He formed an ever-widening community called a Sangha of mendicant disciples from all castes, including women and lay devotees. The major forms of tradition represents the Buddha as teaching an exoteric practical yoga which followed the so-called middle path, a means between the extremes of bodily indulgence, self-mortification and speculative philosophy. It is based on the conviction that neither ritual, manipulation of external physical forms, radical asceticism, example Buddha and Jainism, nor abstract intellectualism can touch the real core of the human problem. The Buddha taught that in life there exists sorrow, suffering which is caused by desire, and it can be cured by following the Noble Eightfold Path. This teaching is called the Four Noble Truths. The Four Noble Truths was the topic of the first sermon given by the Buddha after his enlightenment, which was given to the ascetic with whom he had practiced austerities. First, it is suffering. All creatures' existence is marked by suffering and agonized bondage to the meaningless cycle of rebirths amid a transitory flux which is impermanent and without essential being. Second, the cause of suffering, the desire which leads to renewed existence, that is rebirth. Next, the cessation of suffering, the cessation of desire. Fourth is nothing but the way leading to the cessation of suffering. Now we will understand the Noble Eightfold Path. The Noble Eightfold Path is a way to the cessation of suffering, the fourth part of the Four Noble Truths. In order to fully understand the Noble Truths and investigate whether they were in fact true, Buddha recommended that a certain path be followed, which consists of: first one, it is right viewpoint, that is realizing the Four Noble Truths. Next, right values, that is commitment to mental and ethical growth in moderation. Next, it is right speech, which means one speaks in a non-hurtful, not exaggerated, truthful way. Next, it is right action. Wholesome action means avoiding action that would do harm. Next, right livelihood. One's job does not harm in any way oneself or others, directly or indirectly. Next, it is right effort, which means one makes an effort to improve. Next, it is right mindfulness, means mental ability to see things for what they are with clear consciousness. Next, it is right meditation, which means state where one reaches enlightenment and the ego has disappeared. The solidarity of the earliest mendicant community was centered on the charisma and teachings of Buddha. However, the growing number of converts, the addition of lay devotees, the settlement of a number of communities forced a routinization of discipline and teaching. The main causes for the emergence of Buddhism are: the first one, it is a social cause. A Brahmin-centered, caste-based hierarchical setup was prevalent in the society. The authority to interpret the scripture was vested with the Brahmins. Temples, which were the centers of social life, were controlled by them. Laws of pollution were strictly imposed upon the people of the lower caste. Tribes and Dravidians were out of the caste structure. Second cause was the economic cause. That is, agriculture and cattle rearing were the main source of wealth and livelihood for the people. Brahmins found out ways and means to exploit the lower sections in the society. Kings were made to perform yagas, yagnas and digvijayas, through which the Brahmins benefited a lot. The ordinary people had to contribute a major portion of the income to the kings, Brahmins and the temples. Other cause is the religion. Mode of worship, rituals and religious ceremonies were interpreted by the Brahmins to suit their interest. The Vedas, the Aryankas, the Mimamsas and Upanishads were written to perpetuate the hegemony of the Brahmins. Metaphysical speculations were at their zenith, which was a prerogative of the educated class. Exploitation of the higher caste and the suffering of the ordinary people continued unabated. The Vedic religious practices had become cumbersome and in the context of the society of the period had become in many cases meaningless ceremonies. Sacrifices and rituals increased and became more elaborate and expensive. With the breakup of communities, the participation in these practices also became restricted and as such irrelevant to many sections in the society. Another cause is the growing importance of sacrifices and rituals. It established the domination of the Brahmins in the society. They acted both as a priest and teachers, and through their monopoly of performing sacred religious rites, they claimed the highest position in the society, which was now divided into 4 varnas. Next cause is the contemporary economic and political reasons or developments. Contemporary economic and political developments, on the other hand, helped the emergence of Buddhism or the new social group, which acquired considerable economic power. We have seen that merchants living in cities or even rich agricultural householders possessed considerable wealth. Similarly, the Kshatriyas, whether in the monarchies or in the Gana Samgas, came to wield much more political power than before. These social groups were opposed to the social position defined for them by the Brahmins on the basis of their heredity. As Buddhism and Jainism did not give much importance to the notion of birth for social status, they attracted the Vaisyas to their folds. Similarly, the Kshatriyas, that is the ruling class, were also unhappy with the Brahmanical domination. Briefly put, it was basically the discontent generated by the dominant position of the Brahmins in the society which contributed to the social support behind these new religious ideas. It is worth remembering that both Buddha and Mahavira came from Kshatriya class, but in their search for answers to the pressing problems of the society, they went beyond boundaries set by their birth. Further, when we try to find out how their ideas were received by their contemporaries, we notice that they had a range of people responding to them: kings, big merchants, rich householders, Brahmins, and even courtesans. They all represented the new society which was emerging in the 6th century BC, and Buddha and Mahavira and other thinkers of those times in their own ways responded to the problems of a new social order. The Vedic ritualistic practices had ceased to be of much relevance to this new social order. Buddha and Mahavira were by no means the first to criticize the existing religious beliefs. Many religious preachers before them, like Kapila, Makali Gosala, Ajita Kesa Kambalin, and others, had already highlighted the evils of the Vedic religions. They also developed new ideas on life and God. New philosophies were also being preached. However, it was Buddha and Mahavira who provided an alternative religious order. This was the background which helped the emergence and establishment of new religious orders in the 6th century BC. Now, we will discuss about the impact of Buddhism on Indian society. Though Buddhism disappeared from India, the land of its birth, yet it had exerted great influence on the culture of India. The impacts are like popular religion. Buddhism gave us a simple, intelligible, and popular religion. Buddhism greatly appealed to the people on account of its simplicity, emotional element, easy ethical code, the use of vernacular language, and the methods of teaching. It disordered the abstract of philosophy of Upanishads. Next is the social impact. Before the rise of Buddhism, there was the Varna system. Buddhism opposed the superiority of Brahmins on the ground of birth. For example, Upali, who was a barber by caste, occupied an important position in the Sangha. Next impact is the religion. Buddhism has always been a very simple and basic religion. There were no complicated rituals. It was devoid of any elaborate idea of God and inspired institutional changes in Indian society. Therefore, the Indian society adopted this type of simple religion and expanded it to their liking. Another impact is depending upon the moral teachings. Buddhism imported various good qualities like compassion, non-violence, and truth. All these good qualities shaped human personality and character building. Another impact is the caste system. It rejected the caste system and its evil, including rituals based on animal sacrifices, conservation, fasting, and pilgrimage. It preached total equality. It promoted social equality and social justice. Another impact is on the monastic system. Another contribution of Buddhism was the monastic system. The Buddhist monks obeyed a common head and lived together under a common code of discipline. The head of a monastery was elected by the monks. Gradually, this monastic system was adopted into Hinduism. Its impact could also be found on the development of language and literature. Buddha preached his message in Pali language. Pali was a language of the common people. During Kanishka's time, the Buddhist monks preached the message of Buddha in Sanskrit language. Spread of Buddhism through these languages enriched these languages and their literatures. Its impact was also found on art, architecture, sculpture, and painting. The most fascinating contribution of Buddhism to India was in the field of sculptures and architectures. Buddhist art and sculpture developed with the spread of Buddhism. In art and architecture, stone was used from Ashoka's time. Numerous stupas, chaityas and pillars were constructed. Stupas at Sanchi, Sarnath, Runidai, Baruhit, Dilauli and Jaugarh etc. are some specimen of Buddhist art and architecture. A large number of sculptures of Buddha and Bodhisattvas came to be built according to the Gandhara and Mathura school of art. Mathura became a great center of Buddhist art. The full flowering of Buddhist art can be noticed in the temple of Borobudur in Java, which can be regarded as the architectural wonders of the world. Candi Kalasan, Candi Mendur in Java, dome-shaped stupa at Sanchi, the ancient Damek stupa at Sarnath. The Buddhists set the examples of dedicating cave temples, and this practice was followed by the Hindus and Jainas etc. Its impact can also be found on contact between India and foreign countries. Buddhism established an intimate contact between India and foreign countries. The Buddhist monk carried the gospel of Buddha to the foreign countries from 3rd century BC onwards, and foreign Buddhist pilgrims and students came to India in search of knowledge. The foreigners who came to India were conquered by the rich culture of India and gave up their names and creeds and adopted Hindu names and Hindu faith. Thus, Buddhism contributed largely to the synthesis which produced the modern Hindu society. Its impact can be also found on the development of universities. Most of the ancient Indian universities like Nalanda, Taksila, Nagarjunakonda, Yalabi and schools, Theravada or Hinayana and the Mahayana were the products of Buddhism. The Buddhist monasteries were used for education purposes. In the Buddhist monasteries, the beginnings of vernacular or Prakrit literature were made, which later on developed into an extensive body of literature. Now, its impact can also be found for the respect for animal life. Buddhism laid emphasis on non-violence and the sanctity of animal life. It popularized the creed of Ahimsa Paramo Dharma. The earliest Buddhist text, Suttanapita, boosted the cattle wealth as it declared the cattle to be the givers of food, beauty and happiness. Buddhism pleads for the protection of cattle. The Hindus were originally meat eaters, but due to the influence of Buddhism became vegetarian. Its impact can also be found on the great personalities of India. Like Rabindranath Tagore built up Vishwabharati on the model of Buddhist viharas, were great centers of learning in those days. Dr. B.R. Ambedkar got converted to Buddhism by rejecting Hinduism. Its impact can also be found on the character of the persons. Like Buddhists have always valued characteristics such as compassion, non-violence and honesty. Due to these ethics, Indians adopted these teachings to build character. And to conclude, Buddhism exercised a tremendous influence on Indian culture. It enriched religion, art, sculpture, language and literature of India. Buddhism is a missionary religion and aims at converting the whole mankind to the doctrines of Buddha.